I mean, one of the foremost characteristics of protest on college campuses was the demand by students that the university tailor its curriculum to their needs and not the other way around, that they were not there to be mass processed for the benefit of the government or the corporations, and so we had this appearance through the 60s of what were called free universities. And the characteristic of free universities was students defining what they wanted to study, right? It was a variety of subjects. I mean, from mysticism to macrame to radical politics. I mean, to tarot cards. I mean, but it was all the kinds of things that universities don't normally teach, in which some students said, well, maybe I'm interested in that. Maybe that's what I want to study. Maybe this is my thing in the world to do. Well, what they were aware of was the pressure of families and official authority pressing them in the direction of some other identity they should be cultivating to become successful brokers, bankers, lawyers, white-collar workers. And this sense that that's not me, I'm something else, I want to go in some other direction, became for many people a source of tremendous stress and tension in their lives. And in that sense, you could say that they felt alienated from an identity they had yet to create and assert in the world. The desire of people to define themselves, to find their own identity in the world, on the assumption, on the basis that we can now afford to do this. We no longer have to be a society that has very few identities, and in which there is one very large identity where most people belong, called the masses. Nobody wants to be that anymore. People want to have a sense of, even if it's expressed in a trivial and bizarre way, they want to have a sense that they are their own, they are the captains of their own soul and masters of their own fate. And they may sometimes be deeply deluded about that, but the feeling is there, the need is there. And I take that to be a significant new plateau in cultural history. It certainly makes the world a much more interesting place when you have this grand variety of lifestyles, as we call them, before us.
When you say, were you a member of the counterculture, to an average person aged 39, they say yes. If they smoked marijuana, if they grew their hair long, if they dated a girl differently or a boy differently, if they hung out with their friends. How are we to evaluate, was this truly a youth revolution taking place in this whole period of 63 to 73? That's the period I'm talking about.
When I was looking around for a way to give some historical background to what I called a counterculture, I found myself, believe it or not, going all the way back to the Romantic movement of the early 19th century. And one of the most important aspects of that movement was its deep suspicion, if not hostility, of industrialism. Because the Romantic movement corresponds to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the Western world. And my thought was that what we saw happening in post-World War II America through the 50s and the 60s, was that a lot of romantic values pioneered by romantic artists and poets of more than a century before, had finally found a large audience, a large public. Now, the ideas had been retailed along the way by many other thinkers. But the essential, the most interesting part of the rebellion of the 60s, from my point of view, was that protest against something that goes a little deeper than immediate issues of politics and justice. Now, that was always there, issues of civil rights and of free speech and the whole protest against McCarthyism in America and concern for what we called the other America, meaning poverty in America. All of that was there. But beyond that, there was another level of protest that eventually emerged, and this involved asking very deep questions, as the old Romantic poets had, of the rightness and rationality of an urban and industrial culture. And the whole gesture, of dropping out, of living poor, of dressing in a funky way, of letting your hair grow long, of pursuing the arts, or dope, which incidentally all the Romantic artists were into. If all of those things are a protest against something more than immediate issues of social justice, immediate issues of politics. They are asking deep questions of an urban and industrial order. It is not by any means fortuitous that what we have in the way of an environmental movement, of an ecology movement, a sense of our connection, our obligations to nature, comes out of the period we're talking about. And that is represents a very deep criticism of urban industrial culture. Namely, that it is a culture that may be toxic to the environment and then ultimately to us, that we may be killing the biosphere and therefore killing ourselves and many other species. Now, that perception of industrial culture, a very negative, very critical perception, is something that goes deeper than immediate issues of politics. You're now talking about issues that span centuries or millennia, a sense of obligation to the planet as a whole, the biosphere as a whole. That's what I was most interested in, that this is the first large-scale protest against the values of urbanism and industrialism. And the first voices to raise those issues were the Romantics at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. They had no influence over it. Industrialism simply ran its course. Comes the end of the Second World War. In this period of affluence, we arrive at a generation which is able to resume that critique, resume that protest, and ask deep questions not only about our political order, but our cultural values. Is this the best way to live? Are we perhaps damaging our environment, our obligations to all other living things in a way that is, just as serious as any issue of social justice? I feel that that range of issues begins to get beyond politics and becomes cultural in character. And while these questions, these issues were not always raised in the most graceful way by very young people who are often operating out of sheer instinct, just sort of a gut response to what they saw about them, nevertheless, the issues were raised in a big, loud, and prominent way. And I feel that if you pay attention to those issues, especially those cultural issues, that you will find the real value of that protest. I'd like to add one more thing to this, that ultimately, and perhaps at the deepest level, what a lot of the members of the counterculture came to see was that changing people's cultural values may have to do with changing their state of consciousness. And hence you get this fascination with anything that will change people's mode of perception, open the doors of perception, right? It could be drugs. The fascination with drugs was not fun and games in the 60s. For many people, it was a way to see reality differently, and hopefully, therefore, to change your values. Now, myself, I was always very dubious that this could be done by just dosing on drugs, but it was one of the ideas at the time, but it's connected with a very deep purpose, namely to change the way people experience themselves, others, and the world around them. And it also carried over then into certain religious disciplines. The fascination with Oriental religions was a fascination with a mystical mode of experience. Any of these attempts to cultivate, to strengthen the sub-intellective or non-intellective response to life were essentially attempts to change people's consciousness with the hope that you could then change the culture that sat on top of that state of consciousness. This is a formidable project, and if it wasn't always carried out very gracefully, and it wasn't, I saw a lot of my students ruined by this fascination with drugs. What lay behind it is something still worth considering.
It appears to be generational, that it is a generation of people. It is a generation gap, a word we also don't hear anymore.
Yeah. They had the opportunity to cultivate new values, to experiment with life in a way that often could be either very abrasive or very instructive to the people around them. But often what people in that age range produced in the way of ideas, values, protests, could prove to be infectious far beyond their peers and on the society generally. And so while many people felt put off, I know from my own experience through that period, put off by the sort of adolescent quality of a lot of the protest politics and countercultural activities of that period, nevertheless, in the midst of all of those things, possibilities in life, values were being raised that many people responded to. I mean, I am amazed when I look around me now at how freely we can in the media, in the society generally, in polite society, around a dinner table or at lunch, and in my classrooms, we can talk about matters of sexuality that could never be talked about openly through the 40s, 50s, and even up into the early 60s. Our willingness to accept many different sexual preferences, lifestyles in our society is much greater. The range of social tolerance is much greater than it was before. And if people still feel it's not enough, they should know what it was like back in the 40s and the 50s. I mean, there was simply no openness on these issues. And then the willingness of people to come together to talk about their grievances, what we call, what we called it in the 60s, consciousness raising, which is simply a sort of free confessional style of life, letting it all hang out, talking about what once would have been very private, embarrassing things. But all you have to do is make a comparison between how much more open our society is today, the way it was in the 40s and 50s. And something happened in between. Well, what I can see that happened in between was a very noisy period of protest when people opened up areas of life that had been closed before. And while people may have rejected the kids and the hippies and the flower children and so on, by God, they certainly took advantage of the spirit of many of those movements, which is a spirit of openness and tolerance, and put it into practice. Oh, take something like the prominence in our society today of the four-letter word. I sit down and watch movies today in which, from the opening scene on, you have a run of language which, as a kid, if I had used it, I would have been punished severely, right? And that remained the case, all the way up through the 50s. You realize when Lucille Ball got pregnant, they couldn't use the word pregnant on television. A movie that used the word virgin in the 50s could not be approved by the Hayes office, the censors. It was condemned for that. And then somewhere along the line, and I can remember it fairly specifically, you had students arriving on campus who would get up in the class and use these forbidden words, and the sky did not fall, right? Life went on, and suddenly everyone was freed up. But I'm talking about only one aspect of life, one aspect of the period we're discussing, and suddenly everybody sort of, after an initial shock, freeze up, and something has happened, and influence has been released in the world. Well, I'm suggesting the same thing happened with sexual practices, with nudity. Some people would see this as the corruption of the society, and some people would see this as the liberation of the society. But things get said that you could not say before. Criticisms get raised that we felt it was difficult to raise before. And all I can suggest to you is that often the influence is a matter of seeing or hearing, being exposed to an example of somebody doing something that opens up possibilities for you in life. And you may never then even remember the situation in which that became possible for you, but it happens. Well, let's put it this way. As of the early 60s, what you had was a range of protest on the social scene in America which was many-sided and quite diffuse. I mean, you had people campaigning for free speech on college campuses. You had black Americans campaigning for equal access to employment and education. You had people campaigning for the legalization of marijuana. You had people running the sexual liberation front. Eventually, you would have a lively and important feminist movement on the scene, other people moving off in the direction of the environment and ecology. So you have a diffuse scene filled with protest, filled with discontent, but without necessarily any focus that would bring all of these discontented people together. What Vietnam did, for better or for worse, was quite simply provide a focus around which all of these discontented elements could rally.